Dust Creek was not much of a town, just a handful of wooden buildings scattered across the endless plains, baked by a sun that never seemed to set and a wind that carried more dust than mercy. Life here was hard, and kindness rarer still. Among its weary souls lived Clara Mayfield, a woman whose name was always followed by whispers. She'd been married once years ago to Thomas Mayfield, a ranch hand who died beneath a horse that had lost its footing in a flash flood. Since that day, Clara had lived alone at the edge of town, in a sagging cabin with 1 cow, 2 chickens, and a heart that no longer hoped for anything but survival. They called her the Fat Widow. The words rolled off the tongues of Dust Creek's women like gossip and poison in equal measure. She had once been round-cheeked, soft-eyed, and radiant in her youth, but time and grief had settled in her bones. Her curves, once admired by her husband, had turned her into the subject of ridicule. Every market day, as she sold eggs or mended clothes for coins, she heard laughter behind her back. Too proud to beg, too plain to wed, they said. But Clara had pride, quiet, stubborn pride. When her husband died, she refused charity, refused to leave the land they'd once dreamed of turning into a farm. She stayed even as the well ran low and the soil turned to stone, yet the debts her husband left behind had not vanished with him. On a dry morning in late August, Sheriff Dobson rode up to her cabin, dust rising behind his horse like a brown cloud. He was a large man with a voice that carried the weight of law and the lack of mercy that came with it. "Mrs. Mayfield," he said, tipping his hat just enough to show manners but not enough to mean them. "It's been near 2 years since Tom passed. You still owe the bank $70 on this land. I can't keep holding off the papers forever." Clara stood in her doorway, her worn apron stained with flour. "Sheriff, I'll pay what I can," she said quietly. "If you give me time." Dobson sighed. "Time's up, ma'am. The colonel over at Fort Reno's hiring cooks and laundresses. Maybe you can earn enough before winter. But if you don't, this land goes back to the bank." She swallowed the lump in her throat. The army outpost was a half-day's ride through wild country. Hostile, lonely, full of soldiers and Apache scouts who didn't take kindly to strangers. But what choice did she have? That night she sat by her small fire, mending her one good dress. Her hands shook with every stitch. The words the sheriff had spoken circled her mind like hungry wolves. Work or lose everything. When dawn broke, she hitched her old mule to the wagon, packed a loaf of bread, and left her home behind. The road to Fort Reno was long and silent, lined with sagebrush and the faint scent of rain that never came. Clara's mind wandered to her husband's voice, his laughter, his promise that their land would one day bloom. She blinked hard, pushing back tears. That dream was gone. All she had left now was herself, and even that, she feared, wasn't worth much. By noon, the sun beat down like punishment. When she finally saw the distant flagpole of the fort, her heart fluttered between relief and fear. She could already picture the looks she'd receive, the smirks, the pity, the whispers. Still, she straightened her back and kept walking. As she reached the gates, soldiers turned to look. One muttered something crude, another laughed. But Clara ignored them all. She stepped up to the officer's tent and said, voice trembling but steady, "Sir, I'm here to work. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need." The officer smirked. "We've got plenty of help, ma'am." And then someone chuckled behind him. "No one marries a fat widow, sir. What's she doing here?" The laughter rippled through the camp. Clara's face burned red, her throat tight with humiliation. She turned to leave, her heart breaking with every step. But then from the shadows a voice spoke, deep, quiet, and certain. Let her stay. The soldiers turned. Standing apart from them was an Apache scout, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes dark as riverstone. He looked at Clara, not with mockery or pity, but with something different, something like respect. That was the first time Taza spoke her name, and the first time Clara Mayfield realized her life was about to change forever. The name Taza carried quiet weight within Fort Reno's walls. Among the soldiers, he was both respected and feared, a man caught between two worlds. He had once been a warrior of the Chiricahua Apache, a proud people who roamed the desert long before the white man's forts and flags. Now, under an uneasy truce, he served as a scout for the U.S. Army, guiding soldiers through the land his ancestors had called sacred. To most of the men, Taza was useful, nothing more. They admired his tracking skills but distrusted his silence. He spoke little, moved like a shadow, and carried himself with the calm of someone who had seen too much death to fear it anymore. That morning, when the fat widow from Dust Creek stood before the officers, trembling but defiant, Taza had been watching from the edge of the parade ground. He noticed her before anyone else did. Her dress was faded, her hands raw from work. Yet her eyes held something that the men around her lacked: resolve. When she spoke, her voice wavered, but her words did not. "Sir, I can cook, clean, mend, or nurse. I don't ask for charity, only work." The captain, a lean man with a permanent smirk, looked her over as if she were a piece of worn-out furniture. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "we've already got enough help. Try the settlement. Maybe the preacher's wife can use you." Clara's jaw tightened. The murmur of soldiers behind her grew louder. One of them, a corporal with too much whiskey in his courage, snorted. "Ain't no man gonna hire a fat widow. She'll eat half the rations herself." Laughter burst out. It was cruel, thoughtless, and familiar, the kind of laughter that stripped a person's dignity one piece at a time. Taza's hand twitched near his belt knife. He felt anger rise, not loud and hot like a soldier's, but deep and steady, the kind of anger that came from knowing injustice by heart. He took a step forward, the sunlight glinting on the eagle feather that hung from his hair. "Let her stay," he said. The laughter faded instantly. The captain turned toward him. "You volunteering to pay her wages, Scout?" Taza met his gaze. "She asked for work, not silver. You complain the cook burns the beans. She won't." The captain hesitated, caught between irritation and intrigue. "And you know this how, Apache?" Taza's eyes didn't waver. "Because she's still standing while you all laugh. That means she's stronger than most." The officer gave a slow shrug. "Fine, let her stay. Kitchen duty and laundry. If she causes trouble, she's out." And just like that, Clara had a place, and not out of kindness, but because one man had dared to see what others refused to. Her days became long and harsh. The soldiers gave her the worst chores: scrubbing boots, hauling water, cooking for men who mocked her behind her back. Yet she worked in silence, never answering cruelty with bitterness. Her hands grew red and cracked, her back ached, but her eyes stayed steady. Taza watched her from a distance. He often arrived early before dawn, when the camp was still wrapped in blue-gray light. Clara would already be awake, kindling the fire, her face glowing faintly from the heat. He noticed how she hummed while she worked, soft, broken tunes that sounded like prayers. One afternoon, as she knelt by the river washing the soldiers' shirts, the corporal who'd mocked her rode by. "Don't scrub too hard, widow," he sneered. "Water's cold enough to crack a fat woman's skin." Before she could answer, Taza appeared behind him, silent as wind. The corporal startled when he saw him. Taza's voice was low and even. "A warrior respects the one who feeds him. You laugh like a boy." The corporal muttered something under his breath and rode off. Clara stared, astonished. No one had ever defended her before, not since her husband's death. When she thanked him, Taza only nodded. "You work harder than men who mock you," he said. Those words sank deep into her heart. From then on, she noticed him more, the way he never wasted a word, the way he always seemed to know when the wind would change, the way his eyes softened when they met hers. And though she never dared to speak it, something inside her shifted. The loneliness that had wrapped around her like a shawl for years began to loosen. At night, as she lay on her cot, she thought about the strange Apache man who spoke less than the wind, but saw more than anyone else ever had. And for the first time since her husband's grave cooled, Clara Mayfield dreamed not of loss, but of being seen. Days turned into weeks at Fort Reno, and Clara Mayfield settled into a rhythm that left her too tired to think. Before dawn, she rose, tied her faded shawl around her shoulders, and began her work. By the time the bugle sounded, she'd already kindled the cook fire, drawn water from the well, and set dough to rise. Her back ached constantly, and the skin on her hands had become rough as rope, but she never once complained. The soldiers called her Widow May. Some used the name kindly, others didn't. When they laughed about her weight or her quietness, she simply kept stirring her pots, eyes lowered. Every insult burned, but she'd learned long ago that pride fed no one. Still, one pair of eyes never laughed. Taza, the Apache scout, often passed the kitchen yard on his way to the stables or the trails beyond the fort. He never said much, but Clara could always tell when he was near. There was something steady about him, like the earth itself, silent, enduring, unyielding. One afternoon, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Clara was hanging laundry behind the barracks. A group of soldiers sat nearby, playing cards and passing a whiskey bottle, their laughter carried on the wind. "Hey, Widow May," one of them called out. "How many biscuits can a woman like you eat before breakfast?" The others roared with laughter. Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes on the sheet in her hands. Another voice joined in. "Don't bother her, Jenkins," said a gruff sergeant. "Ain't polite to tease a lady." Jenkins grinned. "Lady, that's a stretch. More like the fort's old mule with an apron." That broke them all into cruel laughter again. Clara turned away, blinking fast. Her throat felt tight, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of tears. As she reached for the next sheet, a sudden silence fell. She turned, and there he was, Taza. He stood a few yards away, hands folded over his belt knife, gaze calm but sharp as flint. He spoke softly, but every man heard him. "You mock her because she works while you sit. You call her names because you have no names worth remembering." The soldiers shifted uneasily. Jenkins tried to laugh it off. "Now don't get sore, Apache. We were just having fun." Taza didn't move. "Fun is easy for men who do nothing." The words hung in the air, heavy as thunder. Then, without another glance, he turned and walked toward the ridge trail, where the setting sun threw long shadows over the plains. Clara stood frozen, the sheet still in her hands. For a long moment she couldn't speak. The soldiers muttered among themselves, embarrassed now, and drifted away. When they were gone, she looked down at the pale fabric fluttering in her grasp and felt something stir inside her chest, something warm and frighteningly new. No one had ever defended her like that, not even Thomas, her late husband, who had loved her but never fought the world for her. That night, as she brought supper to the officer's table, her eyes searched the shadows for Taza. He wasn't there. After the meal, she found him by the corral, checking his horse's bridle beneath the stars. The air smelled of dust and pine sap. "You shouldn't have spoken for me," she said quietly. "They'll only resent it." Taza looked at her, expression unreadable. "They already resent you. Because you work harder than men who mock you." His words were simple, but they struck deeper than any compliment she'd ever received. She tried to smile, but her throat closed around the attempt. "You don't know what it's like," she whispered. "To be laughed at just for being who you are." "I do," he said. "You think Apache are not laughed at?" His gaze drifted toward the horizon. "They call us savages. I learned long ago not to listen." Clara nodded slowly. For the first time, she saw the quiet ache behind his calm. Two outcasts, one white, one Apache, both standing on the same ground, both unwanted by the world that surrounded them. A breeze rustled the dry grass. Somewhere a coyote cried. Clara turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You make this place quieter," Taza said. "Better." She looked back at him, startled. "How?" "Because you bring peace," he said simply. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The moon rose, silver and cold, and the fort lights flickered in the distance. When she finally returned to her quarters, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His words repeated in her mind. "You work harder than men who mock you. You bring peace." And as the night deepened, something began to shift inside her loneliness. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was something gentler, rarer. Hope at autumn crept over Fort Reno quietly, like a shy visitor who stayed too long. The days grew shorter, the air colder, and Clara's hands chapped from the endless washing and scrubbing. But she worked on the way she always had, steady, unseen, and necessary. She had learned to read the moods of the soldiers, when they were likely to be kind, when to keep her head down, when to slip away before their jokes grew cruel. But ever since that day by the laundry line, the day Taza had spoken in her defense, something in the air had changed. The men no longer mocked her as freely. They still muttered behind her back, but not when Taza was near. And somehow he was near more often than before. He would pass by the cookhouse on his way to the stables, nodding once, almost imperceptibly. Sometimes he carried in firewood without being asked. Sometimes he lingered just long enough to sharpen his knife by the doorway while she worked. He never said much, but his silence was not heavy like other men's. It was calm, companionable. Still, his presence unsettled her in ways she didn't understand. One afternoon, She was stirring stew in the great iron pot when the young bugler, Eddie Trask, sidled up to her with a smirk. "Say, Widow May," he teased, "you got the Apache scout bringing you wood now? Must be nice having a big, strong fella doing your chores." A few soldiers laughed nearby. Clara kept stirring, her cheeks burning. "He's just being polite," she said. Eddie chuckled. "Polite, you sure? Some say he's got eyes for you. Maybe he likes his women. Sturdy." The laughter grew louder. Clara turned, her ladle trembling slightly. "Enough," she said, her voice low but steady. "You boys want supper or trouble?" The laughter died quickly. Eddie lifted his hands in mock surrender. All right, Widow May, don't boil us alive." But later that night, when she walked back to her small quarters by the supply shed, she caught whispers carried on the cold wind. "Did you hear? The Apache's sweet on her. Him, on that big woman. Lord help us. Maybe she feeds him extra pie." Their voices faded as she closed her door, but the words lingered. She pressed her back against the wall and drew a shaky breath. She'd lived through gossip all her life, but somehow this cut deeper. Because for once the rumor wasn't cruel, it was possible. And that frightened her most of all. The next morning she avoided Taza. She focused on her chores with almost frantic energy, scrubbing, mending, cooking, anything to keep her thoughts still. But by midday she heard footsteps behind her and turned. Taza stood there, quiet as always, holding a small wooden carving. It was a bird, its wings outstretched, carved with patient precision. "I made this," he said simply. Extending it toward her, Clara froze. "For me?" He nodded. "The bird sings at sunrise even when no one listens. You remind me of that." She swallowed hard, unsure what to say. "I can't take this," she murmured. "It wouldn't be right." He tilted his head. "It's not a gift," he said. "It's peace. You give this camp peace." The words caught her completely off guard. Peace. No man had ever spoken that word to her. Not pretty, not kind, not sweet. Peace. Her throat tightened. She reached out and took the little bird, her fingers brushing his. For a brief second, warmth passed between them. Not fire, not passion, but recognition. A quiet understanding that neither belonged anywhere else but somehow had found each other in this forgotten place. When he turned to leave, she whispered, "Thank you, Taza." He looked back just once. "You don't have to thank me for seeing what's true." That night, Clara placed the wooden bird on her table beside her lamp. Its carved wings seemed ready to lift and fly. She stared at it for a long time, her heart soft and aching. For years she had lived unseen, buried beneath whispers and pity. But now an Apache man with quiet eyes had looked at her, truly looked, and what he saw wasn't a burden or a joke. He saw peace. And for the first time since her husband's death, Clara Mayfield began to feel alive again. The first frost arrived in late October, painting the prairie grasses silver and stiff. Clara wrapped herself tighter in her old shawl each morning, her breath misting in the cold air as she hauled water and built fires before dawn. Fort Reno, once loud with summer noise, grew quiet beneath the winter sky. The soldiers grumbled, their tempers short and their boots wet. But Clara kept the camp steady. Every night she lit the small lamp in her room and looked at the wooden bird sitting on her table. Its smooth wings caught the light like amber. Sometimes she reached out and traced its shape, wondering what it had meant to Taza when he carved it, and why he'd chosen to give it to her. She told herself it was nothing, a simple gesture of thanks. Yet every time she looked at it, something deep within her stirred, something long asleep. Taza came and went as the days passed, silent as a shadow. When he wasn't scouting, he helped the blacksmith or mended saddles or simply walked beyond the fort walls, where the plains stretched forever. Clara noticed how the men stopped their laughter when he appeared, how even the captain spoke more carefully in his presence. There was something untouchable about him, something the white men feared and could not name, and yet, when he spoke to her, his voice softened. One morning, while Clara kneaded dough in the cookhouse, she heard the low rumble of hooves outside. She glanced up. It was Taza returning from patrol. His coat was dusted with frost, his braids stiff with cold. He dismounted and handed her a small bundle wrapped in hide. She frowned. "What's this?" He shrugged. "You dropped your scarf last week. Found it by the stream." She blinked. She hadn't even realized it was gone. "You kept it all that time?" "Didn't want the wind to take it," he said simply. Something fluttered inside her chest on a feeling both sweet and terrifying. You shouldn't have troubled yourself. He looked at her unblinking. It wasn't trouble. There it was again, that quiet strength in his tone. It wasn't flattery, wasn't charm. It was truth. She wanted to say more, to thank him, to ask about his world beyond the fort. But her voice betrayed her. She just nodded, clutching the scarf as he walked away. That evening, when the day's work was finally done, Clara took her seat by the fire behind the kitchen, her bones aching from cold. She thought she was alone until she heard footsteps crunching softly over the frost. Taza appeared again, carrying a bundle of firewood. I brought more, he said, setting it down beside her. You've done too much already, she protested gently. He shook his head. You do much. The men eat, the camp sleeps. You keep it alive. She laughed a little, though her eyes stung. I just do what I can. He sat down on the ground across from her, the flames painting his face in gold and shadow. For a long while they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was steady, almost sacred. Clara could hear the wind moving through the trees, the crackle of the fire, the far-off howl of a coyote. Then, in that hush, he said quietly, You have a strong spirit. Clara Mayfield, she startled a little. He'd never spoken her name before. Somehow in his voice it sounded softer, almost reverent. I don't feel strong, she admitted. I feel tired, Taza nodded slowly. Strength is not about feeling. It is about staying. You stayed when others would have left. That is strength, her throat closed. You speak like a preacher, she murmured. He smiled faintly. My mother said words are only worth using when they heal. The words sank deep into her. She turned her face toward the fire, blinking back tears she couldn't name. After a long pause, she whispered, Why are you kind to me? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady and low. Because you are kind to everyone and no one sees it. Clara's breath caught. The silence that followed was full, not empty. It wrapped around them like the warmth of the fire, carrying unspoken things neither dared to name. When Taza rose to leave, he said softly, Keep the bird near you. When you forget peace, it will remember for you. She watched him walk into the cold night, his form swallowed by the darkness beyond the firelight. And there, in that silence he'd left behind, the silence he called peace, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not love, not yet, but something deeper. Belonging. Winter settled heavy over Fort Reno, turning the prairie into a sea of silver. The nights grew longer, the wind sharper, and the fire became every soldier's refuge. Clara worked harder than ever, her hands cracked from cold and soap, her shoulders stiff from lifting heavy pots. Yet despite the chill and exhaustion, something within her had changed. It was as if that little wooden bird on her table had taken root inside her. Quiet, patient, unyielding. Taza's words echoed through her thoughts when the nights felt endless. When you forget peace, it will remember for you. And so she kept going, not just surviving, but living again. One evening, word spread through the fort like wildfire. A celebration was to be held. The commanding officer had received news of a successful treaty, signed with one of the nearby tribes. To mark the occasion, he ordered a feast, whiskey, and music. The men cheered. Clara sighed. A celebration meant double the work. She spent the day roasting meat, baking pies, and boiling potatoes until the cookhouse was filled with the smells of spice and smoke. When dusk fell, lanterns were strung between the posts and a fiddler began tuning his strings. Laughter rang out across the cold night as the men gathered, boots stamping the frozen ground in rhythm. Clara stood at the edge of the light, wiping her hands on her apron. She told herself she would only stay long enough to make sure no one went hungry. Then she would slip away. But her eyes searched, almost against her will. She found him near the edge of the firelight, Taza standing still as a stone among the restless crowd. He wasn't drinking or laughing. He simply watched, his dark eyes calm, as if the fire were speaking to him alone. When his gaze met hers, something inside her trembled. She looked away quickly, pretending to busy herself with the food table. The fiddler struck up a livelier tune, and men began to dance, clumsy, joyous, unashamed. A few soldiers' wives twirled in their shawls, laughing. Even the captain joined in. Clara smiled faintly at the sight. though her chest ached with a quiet longing she didn't want to name. She hadn't danced since her wedding night long ago. Thomas had led her gently across their tiny cabin floor, humming instead of whistling because he didn't know the tune. She'd laughed until her sides hurt. That laughter felt like another woman's now. Someone she used to be. Someone lost to grief and years. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Why do you watch but not join?" She turned. Taza stood beside her, his presence so close she could feel his warmth through the cold. She stammered. "I'm no dancer, sir." He tilted his head. "I saw you move with the fire when you stir the pot. Your hands remember rhythm." Clara laughed softly. "No one wants to dance with the cook. Especially not a fat widow." His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something deeper. Disbelief. "Then they are blind." Before she could answer, he extended his hand. "Dance with me." Her breath caught. "Taza, people will see." "Let them," he said simply. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still. Then slowly she placed her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough, his grip firm but gentle. He didn't lead her into the wild laughter of the crowd. Instead, he guided her a few steps away, where the light softened and the fire's glow painted their faces gold and amber. The fiddler's tune changed, slower now, haunting and beautiful. Taza moved with quiet grace, his step steady, his gaze never leaving hers. Clara followed hesitantly at first, then more freely, the rhythm finding her body again. The world blurred, the cold, the whispers, the stares, all fading into the sound of their hearts moving in time. For the first time in years, she didn't think of her size, or her sorrow, or her debts. She only felt seen. When the song ended, they stood still in the hush that followed. The fire cracked softly between them. Taza released her hand slowly. "You move like the wind through grass," he said. Clara smiled through the tears that filled her eyes. "You're kind to say so." "I do not say kind things," he replied. "Only true ones." As the laughter rose again around them, Clara stepped back, her heart pounding. The cold air bit her cheeks, but inside warmth bloomed, quiet and fierce. She returned to her quarters that night, unable to sleep. Her feet remembering his steps, her hand remembering his touch. In the stillness, she whispered to the wooden bird, "Maybe peace can dance." Too, and for the first time since her husband's death, Clara Mayfield smiled, not out of duty or politeness, but from the wild, trembling joy of being alive again. The days following the dance passed like a dream Clara didn't dare to wake from. The fort seemed warmer, the mornings gentler. Every time she crossed paths with Taza, something unspoken lingered between them. A glance, a shared silence, the ghost of a smile. But Fort Reno was not a kind place for tenderness. Whispers travel faster than truth, and before long the camp had found a new story to feed on. The Apache's got himself a fat widow. Guess she's found herself a new husband. Must be why she's glowing lately. Love's a strange thing, even for her. The words slithered through the ranks, cruel and mocking. Clara heard them in passing, felt them in the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. At first she tried to ignore it, but the more they whispered, the heavier the shame grew. By the end of the week, even the captain had heard. One cold morning, Clara was scrubbing the long dining tables when the door swung open and Captain Harlow stepped inside. His voice was sharp as frost. "Mrs. Mayfield, a word." She straightened quickly, drying her hands on her apron. "Yes, sir?" He frowned. "You've been spending a great deal of time with our Apache scout." Clara froze. "Only when he comes by the kitchen, sir. He helps sometimes, brings firewood." Harlow cut her off. "This isn't a settlement, ma'am. This is an army post. We have rules about conduct, especially between civilians and Indian scouts." The word Indian left his mouth like a stain. "I mean no harm, Captain," Clara said quietly. "He's been nothing but decent to me." "Decent?" Harlow snorted. "You do well to remember he's not one of us. People are beginning to talk. You'd best put distance between yourself and that savage." She wanted to protest, to tell him that Taza had shown her more decency than any man in this fort ever had. But the captain's stare left no room for argument. "Yes, sir," she whispered. When he left, the silence in the room felt colder than the wind outside. That night, she worked late, kneading bread until her arms ached. She told herself she wouldn't cry. She'd endured far worse: gossip, loss, loneliness. This should have been nothing, but somehow this hurt more, because for once in her life she had been seen with kindness, and now even that was being taken from her. When the door creaked open behind her, she knew before turning who it was. "Taza," she said softly. He stepped inside, his dark eyes searching hers. "You are not at the fire tonight," she forced a smile. "Too much work." He watched her for a moment, reading the truth beneath her words. "They have spoken to you," he said. "The captain," she nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "He said it's improper, that I should stay away." A muscle in Taza's jaw tightened. "Because I am Apache?" "Because they think," she stopped, her voice breaking. "They think there's more between us than there is." He was silent for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "And is there?" Her breath caught. She turned to the window, where the snow swirled softly in the dark. "There can't be," she whispered. "If you care for me, you'll let me be. You'll stay away." Taza took a slow step closer. "You think your life is not worth ruin?" She turned sharply, her eyes wide. "Don't say that, please. You'll lose your place here. They'll turn against you. They already have," he said simply. "But I will not lose myself." Her throat closed. "And I can't lose what little I have left." Their eyes met. Two souls standing on opposite sides of a wall neither had built, both bound by fear and something stronger. Finally, she whispered, "Please." "Taza, go." For a long moment he didn't move. Then with a slow nod he said, "You tell me to go, but your eyes ask me to stay." And before she could answer, he turned and walked into the storm outside. That night, Clara packed what little she owned. The fort, once her prison, had also become her refuge, but she could no longer bear its whispers or the ache of seeing him from afar. At dawn, before the bugle sounded, she hitched her mule to the wagon and left Fort Reno behind. Her heart breaking with every turn of the wheel, she didn't look back. But somewhere beyond the ridge, Taza was already riding after her. The dawn broke gray and bitterly cold over the open prairie. A wind cut across the land like a blade, whispering through dry grass and skeletal trees. Clara Mayfield hunched in her wagon, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, the old mule trudging slowly forward through the frost-hardened mud. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. Fort Reno had become a place of humiliation, a nest of whispers that pecked at her pride until it bled. Leaving felt like tearing a limb from her body, but she'd rather face the wild than another day of pitying eyes. Her hands, red and cracked, gripped the reins. She told herself this was strength, leaving before she broke again. But deep down, beneath the layers of defiance and shame, she knew she was running from one man's eyes, Taza's eyes. By noon, the wind had grown harsher. Clouds rolled low and heavy, promising snow before nightfall. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her lap, glancing back at the long ribbon of land behind her. There was no one, no sign of pursuit, no sound but the creak of the wagon wheels and the low snort of her mule. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Each gust of wind seemed to carry the echo of hoofbeats. Each shadow on the ridge looked like a rider watching her from afar. "Fool woman," she muttered to herself. "You've gone and lost your wits." But when dusk began to fall and the first flakes of snow drifted down, she saw it, him, a dark figure on horseback, distant but unmistakable, riding steadily behind her. Her heart leapt to her throat. For a moment she froze, torn between fear and hope. Then she snapped the reins and urged the mule faster. "Go on, Betsy, go." The mule grumbled but obeyed, its hooves thudding hard against the frozen ground. Clara's breath came in short bursts of panic. Why was he following her? Didn't he understand she'd left for his sake as much as her own? The figure didn't slow, didn't call out, just kept riding. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the storm had swallowed the prairie whole. Snow swept in thick sheets, turning the world to white. The wagon creaked and swayed as the mule stumbled, half blind. Clara's hands were numb, her face raw from windburn. She could barely see more than a few yards ahead, but she pressed on, until the wagon hit a rut and tilted sharply. "Betsy!" she cried. The mule brayed and halted, refusing to move another step. Clara climbed down, boots sinking into snow, and tried to push at the wheel. It was no use. The wagon was stuck. That's when she heard it. The low, rhythmic sound of hooves drawing closer. Her chest tightened. She turned slowly. Through the swirl of snow, a shape emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a buffalo hide cloak. "Taza," she breathed. He dismounted without a word, his movements calm but urgent. His hair was dusted white with snow, his face unreadable in the fading light. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice breaking. "You shouldn't have left," he replied simply. She tried to look away, but his eyes held hers like an anchor. "The captain was right," she whispered. "They'll call you a fool for chasing after a woman like me. They say many things," he interrupted, stepping closer. "But the wind does not stop for their words. Taza," he lifted his hand, brushing a snowflake from her cheek. "You run from what already lives in you." She shook her head, tears freezing on her lashes. "I'm not what you think I am. I'm old, I'm heavy, I've buried a husband. You are strong," he said firmly. "You carry your sorrow like a warrior carries his wounds. That is beauty." The words broke something inside her. All the walls she'd built, of shame, of fear, of self-loathing, cracked under the warmth in his voice. The wind howled around them, the snow thickening, but in that small circle of silence between them, something wild and sacred stirred. He stepped closer until they stood inches apart. The warmth of his breath touched her skin. "I will take you back when you wish it," he said. "Not when they command it. But I will not let you vanish into the storm." Clara looked up at him, the ache in her chest unbearable. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care?" Taza's gaze softened. "Because when you look at me, I remember I am not a ghost in their world. You see me as I am," she swallowed hard, "and I see you as more than they ever will." For a long moment, they stood there, two souls exiled by the world, finding refuge in each other beneath the falling snow. Finally, Taza took her hand, steady and sure. "Come," he said. "The prairie will not forgive us if we stay still." And as he led the mule forward through the storm, Clara followed, not as a woman fleeing her shame, but as one walking beside a man who had given her back her courage. By the time Taza found shelter for them, the storm had deepened into a blizzard. The prairie was a white wilderness, sky and earth blended in one endless sheet of snow. But Taza knew the land like it was part of him. He led Clara and the mule through the drifts to a hollow between two rocky outcroppings, where a narrow cave hid beneath the slope. Inside, the wind's howl softened to a mournful whisper. Taza built a fire quickly, his hands sure and efficient even as the cold bit through his coat. Clara sat near the wall, shivering uncontrollably. Her dress was soaked to the hem, her lips pale. He draped his buffalo hide cloak around her shoulders. "Sit close," he said. The cold steals breath faster than fear. She hesitated for only a moment before inching nearer to the fire, the heat biting at her frozen skin. The flames painted their faces in golden shadow, flickering across the cave's stone walls. Outside, the storm raged on. But in here there was stillness, a fragile, tender stillness that made Clara's heart ache. For a long time, neither spoke. The crackle of fire and the distant moan of wind filled the silence. Clara kept her eyes on the flames, her hands trembling in her lap. Finally, she said softly, "You shouldn't have come after me." Taza's voice was calm. "The hawk follows the wounded bird, not to hunt, but to protect." She gave a weak laugh. "I'm no bird, Taza. I'm a woman who's made a fool of herself." He looked at her steadily. "You are a woman who tried to save a man from losing his place. That is not foolishness. That is love." The word love seemed to hang between them like smoke. Clara's breath caught. She turned away quickly, blinking back tears that glimmered in the firelight. "You don't understand," she said. "I've lost too much to believe in that word. It takes more than it gives." Taza shifted closer, his expression unreadable. "Then you have only known love that wounds." "Mine does not." Her throat tightened. "Yours?" He nodded slowly. "Since the first day I saw you in the kitchen, your hands red from work, your eyes tired, but your spirit still burning. You looked at me not as a savage, not as a thing, but as a man. That was the first time I remembered what my mother said. Even in captivity, the heart can be free." Clara stared into the fire, unable to speak. Her mind spun, but her heart understood. "I never meant to," she began. He interrupted gently. "You do not choose when the sun warms your skin. It just does." Her lips parted, trembling. "But Taza, look at me. Look at what I am. I'm not the kind of woman men cross storms for. I'm plain. I'm worn. I've buried my dreams in the ground beside my husband." Taza reached out, his hand brushing the edge of her cloak where it covered her trembling hands. "You are not plain," he said quietly. "You are alive, and that is rare." Something broke loose in her then. Years of silence, of loneliness, of believing herself unworthy, all rising at once. The tears she'd held back finally fell. "I thought if I worked hard enough, maybe I could forget what it felt like to be wanted," she whispered. "But you make me remember, and that terrifies me." Taza's gaze softened, his voice low and steady. "Then let the fear stay. Fear means the heart still beats." He leaned closer, not touching her, but his presence wrapped around her like the fire's warmth. "If you tell me to go, I will. But know this, Clara Mayfield. I have already chosen you in my spirit. Even if you send me away, my heart will still walk beside you." Clara looked at him through her tears. This man who spoke with the quiet certainty of the earth itself. And in that moment, all the lies she'd been told about herself fell away. She lifted her hand, and hesitant, trembling, and touched his cheek. The warmth of his skin beneath her fingers made her pulse quicken. "I don't know if I can love again," she whispered, "but I know I don't want you to leave." Taza's eyes darkened, fierce and tender all at once. "Then I stay." The storm howled outside, but in that cave the fire burned steady, and so did the space between them, fragile, sacred, alive. For the first time in years, Clara no longer felt like a widow clinging to survival. She felt like a woman standing at the edge of something vast and wild, something that might yet save her. When morning came, the storm had passed. The prairie lay buried under a soft white hush, glistening beneath a pale sunrise. Smoke rose lazily from the cave's mouth, and inside the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Clara woke slowly, the heavy buffalo hide cloak still wrapped around her shoulders. For a brief, still moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the warmth beside her, the steady sound of a man's breath, brought it all rushing back. Taza was sitting near the cave's opening, sharpening his knife against a flat stone. His movements were slow, rhythmic, peaceful. He turned slightly when she stirred, his dark eyes soft. "You slept," he said. "That is good." Clara pushed herself upright, brushing her hair from her face. "I didn't mean to. She smiled faintly. "I think the storm wore me out." He nodded toward the horizon. "The world begins again after storms." She followed his gaze. Outside, the land stretched vast and clean, the snow sparkling under the new sun. It was beautiful, and somehow it looked forgiving. Taza rose, walked to the fire, and poured her a tin cup of coffee from the small pot he'd set on the coals. It was strong and bitter, but it warmed her all the way down. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the kind of silence that asks for nothing and gives everything. Clara found herself studying his face, the quiet strength of it, the calm that seemed carved into his bones. At last, she said softly, "What will happen now?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You ask with fear." "Why?" She hesitated. "Because I know what people will say if I go back." "About you." "About me." Taza smiled faintly. "Let them speak. The wind carries words away faster than truth." "But the fort," she whispered. "I left without permission. They'll say I ran off, that you—" She trailed off, unable to finish. He understood anyway. "That I stole you," he said simply. Her eyes met his. "Yes." Taza set down his knife, his voice low and even. "Then let them. A man cannot steal what walks beside him by choice." Her throat tightened. "You don't understand their world, Taza. They make rules for who's worth loving and who's not." His gaze held hers, fierce and unwavering. "Then break their rules." The words hit her like a blow and a balm at once. Break their rules, it sounded impossible. And yet, hadn't she already done it? By leaving? By surviving? By sitting here beside him, wrapped in his cloak, drinking coffee over the ashes of a fire they'd built together? She looked down at her hands, scarred, rough, strong, and realized she was not the woman who'd arrived at Fort Reno months ago. When the sun climbed higher, they packed their few things. Taza loaded the mule, tightening the harness while Clara stood watching the wide white horizon. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. He paused, then looked up at her. "North, maybe. Toward the Black Mesa. There is quiet there. The earth remembers peace," she nodded, her heart heavy. "And me?" Taza's eyes softened. "You have always known your path, Clara Mayfield. Even when you thought you had none." She tried to smile, but her chest ached. "If I go back, they'll never understand. And if you stay?" he asked. The question hung between them. Simple, dangerous, true. Clara's heart beat hard in her chest. The air smelled clean and new, and somewhere inside her a voice she'd silenced long ago whispered, "You've lived half a life long enough." She met his gaze. "If I stay, I lose everything I was." Taza stepped closer, his hand rising to touch her face. "No," he said softly. "If you stay, you become everything you are." Her breath caught. The truth of it settled deep inside her. Deeper than fear, deeper than reason. Slowly, she reached up and covered his hand with hers. "Then I'll stay," she whispered. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind brushed past the cave, carrying the scent of pine and snow. The world felt vast and empty, yet somehow full. Taza smiled, a rare, quiet smile that reached his eyes. "Then we begin." He helped her onto the mule saddle, then swung up behind her, his arm steady around her waist. As they rode out into the morning light, Clara looked back once at the distant fort, at the life she'd left behind. It was already fading into the snow. She turned forward again, feeling the steady heartbeat against her back, the rhythm of hooves beneath her, the wind alive in her hair. For the first time in years, the horizon no longer looked like an end. It looked like a beginning, and when Taza's voice came low against her ear, "You are not a widow anymore, Clara Mayfield. You are a flame that would not die." She smiled, tears bright in her eyes, and whispered, "Then let it burn."